Good. I understand we are now back on and being recorded. And if Mr. Keane and colleagues um, have um, have concerns about the IT, apparently it ran out just before you made your introduction. So I think for the benefit of anybody watching this recording, I think if you reintroduce your team, Mr. Keane, I don't know, only you again. Yes, it's really has.
So, good morning. My name is Graham Keane, King's Counsel, here on behalf of Defence Infrastructure Organisation, and I have to my left Mr. Christopher Tennant of GL Hearn on planning matters, Mr. Ben Hunter of EFM on education, and Mr. Tom Jones of WSP on highways matters, and then behind me Mr. Jeremy Sawtell and Ms. Louise Spalding from DIO, Defence Infrastructure Organisation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And as I was attempting to introduce, obviously this follows on from a previous hearing session on the 24th of November, which considered various proposed main modifications to the policy for the Invicta Barracks site. That culminated in my issuing of initial stage 1 findings early in January in document ED 70. And as I indicated earlier, the purpose of this session, I think, is to reopen matters so that we're clear on the approach to education infrastructure in relation to this strategic site within the Maidstone urban area. For the benefit of everybody here, I mean, just to remind ourselves in terms of potential proposed main modifications to the policy, one is to specify for your new bullet point the provision of an 8th form entry all through school. Is that better? Is that, yep, okay. So the proposed modification, as I say, is for a provision of an 8th form entry all through school, 2 form entry primary, 6 form entry secondary provision on the site, subject to continuing review of future educational need in Maidstone Borough and an ongoing assessment of other sites with scope to accommodate some or all of the educational need. There will also be a proposed modification to include what I would describe as a sort of a concept framework diagram for the site, which would show the potential future educational land provision. And then a further modification which would remove or delete the secondary school requirement being established within phase 2 and to move the requirement for the identification of land for future educational needs and mechanisms for transfer within phase 1 of the development. So that in summary was where we'd got to in relation to the initial discussion. I think what I would be keen to understand now, in light of holding this session, and in addition to the documents that have now been provided by Kent County Council in terms of their commissioning plan and their approach to commissioning education provision, their concerns with the direction of travel and where we're going in relation to the Invicta Barracks site. So if I hand over to Ms. Wigley first, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. I hope my microphone's working. I think it is. So yes, there are a number of concerns arising out of the direction of travel. Your paragraph 5.31 in your 11th of January letter, in our view, significantly waters down the provision of a secondary school on this site. The type of school, there's no issue about the type of school between us, the 2 form entry, sixth form entry. But what we are particularly concerned to ensure is that there is a clear, unambiguous allocation of land to provide that school, and that the land is provided in a cleared and serviced site, because the other real element of concern arises out of the framework diagram, which proposes the education provision on the what we see as the most difficult part of the site to develop, because it's covered in mature trees and significantly a large degree of existing housing. And because of the shape of the site, which appears to have been drawn around land ownership boundaries rather than any practical consideration of the provision of a school, we are concerned that the costs of constructing a school on that site will be very significantly in excess of the usual average costs. So the usual average costs are around 25 to 30 million, and we estimate that it would be around 55 million to develop a school on this site, due to the gradient, the shape and the size. So as a result of that, we have had a large degree of correspondence and negotiations with Maidstone to seek to have a modification which accommodates that concern. And that culminated with what we thought was agreed, which was wording which we attached to our letter to you on I think it was the 19th of December, where there was an appendix to that letter which set out the wording we were seeking. And to help people who don't have it in front of them, it was a criteria a provision in the policy in phase 1 from 2027, provision of bare serviced and accessed land suitable in size, shape and condition for construction of an 8 FE all-through school, 2 FE primary and 6 FE secondary on the wider Invicta Barracks site, the opening date of which is anticipated to be early within the development. This timing will be subject to continuing review of future educational need in Maidstone and Borough, and will be determined and evidenced by Kent County Council. So that's the wording we are seeking. And so it's important to note there that the further continuing review, which we accept will be necessary, is only in respect of the timing of the provision and not whether the school is needed at all. We have been unambiguous and clear throughout, from before the Regulation 19 response and consistently in that response and following, that there will be a need for an additional school to serve this local plan beyond the school in Heathlands, which is to serve that site alone. And that's clear in our commissioning plan, which we've put in, and you'll have seen the figures there. And there's never been any challenge to that from anyone, so far as we're aware, to the existence of that need. And if there is challenge to that, then we're prepared to provide more information, and we can talk you through the figures. I can talk you through the figures in a moment. So that's the position, and really it all comes from national policy. The starting point, as you know, in the NPPF, paragraph 16D, is that the plan should contain policies that are clearly written and unambiguous, so it's evident how a decision maker should react to the development proposals. Paragraph 17C, the plan should make sufficient provision for community facilities such as education. And paragraph 34, it should set out the contributions expected from development, such as that needed for education. And paragraph 95A should give great weight to the need to create schools through the preparation of plans. So we have all the policy support. So we also have the support in relation to the viability issue, because of course what we are very concerned about is that if this need for a school is not allocated in the plan, and if provision is not made for contributions to fund the school through the plan, then developers will understandably be able to argue that they hadn't factored that in when they bought their sites, and will be able to produce viability assessments saying, well, we can't be required to make these contributions. So there is a very clear support through the NPPF and the PPG for sorting this out now. And so the PPG cross-references the document which we put in, which has been produced by the Department for Education, the Securing Education Contributions document from 2019. And so that is also clear and unambiguous as to what we should be seeking through a development plan and what decision makers should be considering. It's clear that basic need funding is effectively a last resort, and the funding for land and construction should be the first assumption that can all be achieved through contributions from developers of large housing sites. So it's also clear in that document that we should be looking for a clear, accessible and service site. You'll see that in paragraph 32 of that document. Work to ensure that planning policies and obligations require a suitable school site to be made available at the appropriate time. The site must be identified and agreed at an early stage, giving consideration to its accessibility and condition at the point of transfer. And so there's also guidance in here to deal with the situation where the land may not be, the need for the school may not be prompted by the site that's providing the land, or the whole need for the school might not be prompted by the site that's providing the land. And there it's clear in paragraph 22 that policies can be included, precise policies setting out the total amount of land required, the approach to securing equitable developer contributions when one developer provides the land for a new school, though the need is generated by more than one development or phase. So we have consistently sought to get our concerns accommodated in the plan. We've suggested this to Maidstone throughout. We've said we'll consider other options, we'll consider other texts in other policies or in this policy, and we thought we'd solved it by having the text that we thought we'd agreed in November. But we then found that had been very significantly watered down, and that the area of the site that is proposed for education is to be set in stone effectively and create all the additional costs and funding problems that we're going to have to deal with. So that's really where we're coming from at the moment.
Thank you. So just so I'm clear, Ms Wigley, from Kent County Council's position, as you say, it's additional or revised wording in terms of safeguarding and securing the the all-through school provision. I think noting the emphasis on the secondary elements. You say that the need for this has not been challenged. I think I'm going to hear to the contrary, probably what I heard back in November in terms of whether this is needed, and certainly that if there is a need for education provision, it's not exclusively related to this site. It would be serving a wider need. But can I also be clear from Kent County Council's position, it's also an objection to the inclusion of a concept framework that identifies that specific site. So is your suggestion, Ms Wigley, that there needs to be more flexibility or less prescription at this stage in terms of?
Well, so the concern that we are agnostic in a sense, because all we want is a school. But the difficulty that site location gives us is the increased funding issue. And we are going to have difficulty obtaining an increased rate of contributions to deal with that increased cost if it's not set out in the plan. So if that is the site we're going to be left with, then perhaps what we need is a criteria or a provision in every other land developer allocation requiring a contribution and explaining why there's an increased education contribution to fund a school on the Invicta site, so that down the line we can obtain the necessary funding from all the developers whose housing is contributing to the need.
Okay. Thank you. And just so I'm clear on Kent County Council's position, as I say, I've read your representations on the proposed submission plan. I mean, is Kent County Council's position? It's unequivocal that there is a need now for, or in the short term, for this education provision in terms of the new through school provision.
Well, so those, perhaps if I just take you to the commissioning plan. We are clear. I don't know whether it's been given a number, the commissioning plan, in the documents, but it was one that was added to the library. You'll see at page 85 of that plan that there is already a deficit in places shown through the projections, and that is only set to increase significantly over the plan period. The projections, we've done analysis which show that the projections have been, since 2009, have been 99.4% accurate. There's always an element of uncertainty in projections, but we have absolutely no doubt that there will be a need for a new secondary school early in the plan period. You can see that there's already we're already close to deficit, and my understanding, my instructions are that there are in excess of 19,000 dwellings in the plan, or left over from the old plan and in the new plan, plus extant development over the period to 2038. Now, of course, they will give rise to the need for school places. We're already on the brink. There can be absolutely no doubt that there is an urgent need.
Unless I'm corrected, I mean, I think that 19,000 figure is for the whole kind of local plan. Obviously, there are proposals elsewhere in the document for the secondary provision at Heathlands and other school provisions. So I note that. In terms of responding to Kent County Council's position, obviously I'm mindful. I heard about education previously in November. There's certainly people around the table who spoke to me about it then. Responses to the position in relation to this kind of no challenge to the need, and if there is the need, Kent County Council's proposal that there needs to be more clarity in the policy in terms of providing an accessible and serviced site, but without perhaps the prescription that it's in the location identified on the concept framework diagram. I'll invite Mr. Keane first, but then I'll come back to the council.
So thank you, and if I may, what I'd like to do is just I'll start if I may, and then I'd like to just ask Mr. Hunter to come in, and perhaps Mr. Well, we'll see how we go. But, so if I start and Mr. Hunter perhaps follows. So can I, with those specific points in mind, can I just step back a little bit, because both the position is, as you know, that Maidstone Borough Council and DIO, my clients, have a clear and agreed position in relation to the policy requirements for the barracks in respect of infrastructure, education infrastructure, amongst other things, and that's set out in the Statement of Common Ground that was before you in November, sir, and sought main modifications which were subsequently endorsed by you in your interim letter in January. And so just I start there because, unless I'm told otherwise, it remains my understanding that that is still the common position between the Borough Council, who promotes this plan, and DIO. So that stage one session resulted in no further matter issue question from you, sir, on this issue. No supplementary question either. There was, as you've already indicated, one highways matter. We'll come back to that perhaps. But we then have the letter of March from Kent County Council setting out a number of criticisms that are based on what it regards as an insufficiency of education infrastructure to support the plan, sir, in relation to borough needs, and we're told that the county council intends to establish a new secondary school between 2027 and 2030. So it's common ground, and I think common ground also with the county, that residential development of the barracks for approximately 1,300 dwellings would not generate the need for the provision on site of a secondary school. As I recall from November, it would generate approximately 1.5 to 2 form equivalents worth of provision. So the need arises because of already approved or planned housing sites in Maidstone, and this is therefore a strategic borough-wide infrastructure requirement that will need to be funded through other development as well as the barracks contribution. So the statement of common ground sets out therefore what remains the agreed approach on education infrastructure with Maidstone. In essence, as you already outlined, Sarah, review takes place in phase 1. And if the school is required, the acquisition and construction can take place on land identified. And if not, Sarah, and I'm telling you what you know from your interim letter, because if not, because need isn't identified, or indeed, sir, provision has already been delivered, or indeed alternative schemes can accommodate the demand, or indeed the number of spare places has risen. And of course, sir, it may well be the case, probably will be the case, that local places will be freed up when the service family accommodation area is vacated. But in those events, then, as presaged in your interim letter, the land might be available for alternative uses. And so can I give you one reference in that statement of common ground? I don't ask you to turn it up for present purposes, but the statement of common ground on education 3.8 details the need for further work to be carried out to better understand the requirements or future contributions that would be generated. So I just give that for reference really at this point. So it's our position that the main modifications that were before you and that you have considered in your interim letter provide an appropriate degree of precision and flexibility. And so it isn't the case that my clients accept Kent's need case, and as you rightly recalled, you heard from Mr. Hunter in November on that very topic, or indeed its argument, Kent's argument, that there's no need for any further review. So I'll ask Mr. Hunter to pick up on this, but it's my understanding that the future forecasts have not been particularly good when one looks back at identifying future need with any degree of certainty, and projections consistently being lower than forecast, etc. But I'll leave that for Mr. to Hunter to pick up. But the point, sir, is that it is therefore necessary to have a review mechanism for the need to be established, and indeed for the business case to be established, because this is land that will have to be assigned a value, and so of course the proportion attributable to the barracks children that will be generated in due course will need to be provided, but the funding around the rest of it will need to be found elsewhere. So in relation to the proposed modification that Kent had put forward, bare serviced access land available within the first phase of development capable of being constructed by 2027. So on the basis of the need concerns that my client has already raised, we say that's onerous and unjustified and indeed unworkable. You'll recall, sir, phase 1 is approximately, I think, up to 500 dwellings. So there won't be the funds to generate it at that point to enable such provision. So I'd just take a couple of other points. One on qualitative points, as it were, the size, shape, condition of the site, and then I'll deal with timing, and then I'll stop for now. So there's been complaint made about the blue land as shown on the key diagram, the SFA area, in Kent's letter, saying that, well, it seems simply to relate to ownership boundaries. Well, so you all know that that's correct because it relates to the long leasehold land held by Annington. But so I would really resist any implied criticism on behalf of my clients that there's been anything other than a fully constructive, engaged and proactive response on this. Until Reg 19 version of the plan was published, the requirements for this site were for a 2 FE primary school to be provided. And so you've already detailed in your interim letter in January, recognising the very considerable amount of expert technical assessment and appraisal work that has gone into what is a quite heavily constraints influenced site. And therefore that was the basis upon which was being prepared. At Reg 19 stage, it suddenly appeared that there may be a requirement for a school. So despite that extensive master planning, the vision document, the roadmap, etc., on a sensitive site, that was the approach that had been taken, and it's in my submission unfair to criticise the DIO or indeed Annington for constructively and proactively showing land where it is then said potential future educational needs might need to be provided in response to that Reg 19 change. So the site would, as we know, require some clearance and preparation. There is existing service accommodation on there at the moment, but as I understand Maidstone's position to be, we'll be told, if I'm wrong about this, they don't consider the SFA area to be a particularly complicated or unusually complicated site for a school. It may not be as rectangular as other sites, but it certainly is of sufficient area to meet the bulletin requirements for school provision. And so before we start contemplating, well, where else might it go, if that's where Kent are going with this, I come back to the point, sir, that this is a site that has been heavily worked up with technical assessment, roadmap, vision planning around all the heritage and tree constraints, etc., etc. And you will recall, sir, that at Reg 19, my client's representations explained the implications for plonking the school elsewhere on the barracks allocation, potentially a reduction of between 350 and 730 dwelling units on what is unquestionably a very sustainable and suitable site for residential. So that sort of level of reduction, sir, would obviously have real and adverse consequences, not just for the real people out there who need a home, but of course for Maidstone's housing land supply, aside from the significant implications for viability, etc., and deliverability. One thing, last point, sir, for me on timing. We haven't heard anything about that really from Kent. They tell us, well, this morning, but if we look at their March letter, what that tells us is that the school, the new school, the 6FE school, may need to be open by 2027. That's 9.9.13 of their March letter, and indeed 9.9.6. Kent intends to establish a new secondary school within the borough between 2027 and 2030. So if that's the case, then the local education authority, with its duties to provide school places, frankly ought to have been looking for a site and getting going on it, because that is not something that will be facilitated or possible on this site, because as you know, sir, the army don't vacate until 2029. So even on the Kent's need case, there is no scope for school provision. Again, I'll defer to Mr. Hunter, but as I understand it, if we assume that the army leave in 2029, as they have said that they will, and they're committed to do, then there isn't going to be a site built and ready and open before, what, 2032, 33, I would have thought at the earliest, but I'll ask Mr. Hunter to confirm that. So even on the council's need case, this isn't the solution to the bump in the numbers. This is coming 6 years after, I think, the numbers potentially a new school on this site. So I'd ask you to bear that in mind, sir, because need aside, timings seem to me to be something that it remains a little unclear how Kent seem to square that circle. So can I turn to Mr. Hunter?
Thank you very much. Certainly I can confirm, sir, that if the site is required around 2027, that this is simply not possible. Just to reaffirm that the military will be on the site until 2029. At that point, following the stage that they leave, the site will need to be cleared, serviced, and fully remediated. That is absolutely recognised, and then at that point provided to Kent County Council in order for them to construct the school. Now, the earliest that they will be able to construct a school having received the land is, I would imagine, 2 years from experience. I don't think that a secondary school of this size could be delivered any quicker than that, in which case you are looking at the 2030s. Now, turning to Kent's figures, if you look at the most recent school projections in the public domain that were published by the Department for Education in March of this year, Kent County Council are suggesting that in the Maidstone non-selective area that the roll is going to go from 7,842 to 10,000 in 2021-22 academic year to 10,402 pupils by 2028-29. Now, this is clearly a significant rise. Kent has done work to date to expand secondary schools within Maidstone, but clearly this is demand that is not coming from this development. This is very much demand for places that are for pupils that are already in the system. Now, Kent has a statutory duty to ensure sufficient pupil places for their area. If this site is not available, which clearly it isn't within the time frame that they're talking about, then alternative measures will have to be found. And whether that is working with the Department for Education and their infrastructure arm located in order to find a site, that is very much what should be occurring. Now, if Kent establishes that the need is so great that new places are required regardless of this development coming forward before the site is available, then new provision may well be delivered. If new provision is delivered, it is very unlikely that more than one secondary school will be required, and it is on that basis that we discuss the need for a review at the time of the development coming forward. Now, clearly this is something that Kent will be doing regardless, because it's a significant infrastructure project that requires thorough due diligence, it requires a business case, it requires consultation, it requires going through committee, it requires the regional director on behalf of the Secretary of State approval in order to bring a school forward. That what we are referring to in terms of the need being established is simply the processes that will be occurring prior to any school coming forward. So certainly I think it's an important point to raise. As we discussed previously, the Invicta site is forecast to generate in the region of about 1.6 forms of entry worth of secondary school pupils. Now, that is if you don't take account of the pupils that are already on the site, that are from the military families. Now, once the military leaves the site, so will those pupils, which means that it will be many years before there's actually a net positive number of secondary school pupils on this site, because actually it'll be a net negative number following them leaving. So the demand is very much coming from the pupils that are already in the system. And really what the work that we've undertaken and what we've referred to previously is that if Kent see the need for accommodating those pupils that are already in the system prior to this site coming forward, that they'll need to find appropriate infrastructure to accommodate those pupils. Now, just to very briefly as well touch on the projections themselves, if we look at, for example, the 2018 forecast produced by Kent County Council, that suggested that in the 2021-22 academic year, there would be 14,111 pupils in the secondary school system. The actual number in 2021-22 was 13,201. Now, we're looking at different projections. Clearly, they're undertaken every year, but what we obviously have to take into account is the fact that when this site does come forward, we will have had 6 or 7 different iterations of those projections, adjusting the numbers. And again, it's on that basis that it's important to establish at the time that the land is available, when it actually, at the point that this development needs to mitigate its impact, is the need for that provision there. And certainly if it is, then there will be a serviced and remediated site available for that provision as per our discussions. But clearly if it isn't, then there is the opportunity for other uses. And sir, clearly from just to discuss the land itself, as discussed, this will be a cleared and serviced and remediated site. EFM has undertaken work to actually look at whether a secondary school can be accommodated on that land, and it's certainly clear from our perspective that it can. It's within the building bulletin 103 size, and certainly there's nothing from our perspective that we've seen that the provision cannot be delivered on that school, on that site.
I mean, various figures I think are before me. I mean, the council's infrastructure delivery plan, the latest version that's before the examination, I think ascribes a cost of 36 million for secondary school provision on this site as a particular cost. I've obviously heard from the county council this morning in relation to the figure it suggests would be required, I think, was 55 million on this site. I don't know, Mr. Hunter, in terms of your analysis or work, whether you've arrived at a view on a likely cost for delivery of a secondary school, or the new through school, the secondary school element as well.
Sir, that work has not been undertaken. The only thing that I can say is that we've certainly looked at significantly more complicated sites that have come in significantly lower than that. There's nothing from the work that we've undertaken to suggest that it's going to be at such a cost. I don't know whether land remediation has been included in that figure or whether it's just infrastructure, but certainly there's nothing that in the work that we've undertaken to suggest that there will be such a significant jump.
Thank you. Thank you for that. If I can now turn to the Borough Council in respect of what I'm hearing this morning from Kent County Council in terms of what they've previously provided in writing in terms of what they're seeking for this site and the Borough Council's position. Is it Ms. Thomas to lead off?
Thank you, sir. Yes. Well, excuse me. Yes, you see that we have a policy wording put forward, which it is basically to says that their mechanisms will be agreed for provision of land to Kent County Council for future education needs, subject to need being established by KCC. And that's what we had considered was necessary in this case. I just want to start by just reiterating a point that my learned friend Mr. Keane has made, and that's really about whether the need arises from the Invicta Park Barracks sites or indeed from other sites that we've allocated in the local plan review. And I start by saying, first of all, that it's clear in the adopted local plan at paragraph 4.193 that the Invicta Park Barracks was to be released by 2027, and it was clear that the site had potential to deliver in the order of 1,300 new homes, of which a minimum 500 were envisaged to be delivered within the planned period. So that was before 2031, which was the period. So it's always been known that the site was going to be occupied up until about 2027. Things have moved on, and we know now from the Invicta evidence to the inquiry that the planned date of leaving is 2029, but there is a potential for a first phase of housing development to be released from 2027, but it's only about 150 houses. And circa 150 prior to the site being actually vacated by the army. So it's been in the public domain that this site, the County Council know this, really wouldn't be available till 2027 or 2029. So we now have Kent County Council saying that, and again, their letter I'm going for is the 8th of March of this year, saying that and this is 9/13, the secondary school may need to be open by 2027. Well, of course, that just isn't possible, and it's been known that isn't possible. So if indeed they are finding, and they have said that they have a need for a school, or they're going to have excess secondary school pupils to find places for, then I'm afraid that something has gone wrong with their planning. And you know, the need that has arisen is really from growth that's in the existing system, and not necessarily growth that is planned in this LPR review. So that's really the starting point, where this, if there is this need, then it's always been clear that it wouldn't be solved by the Invicta site coming forward, that piece of land. But if indeed they do have an excess number of secondary school pupils that they can't find a land for, clearly we as a local authority are certainly willing to help with that. And we're also obviously willing to help with any abnormal costs that there might be in developing this site on the Invicta Barracks. And you'll hear from Mr. Coyne that we've discussed several ways that we might be able to help them with that. But you'll also hear from Ms. Nola, as you've heard from Mr. Hunter, that there has been this bulge of secondary school pupils coming for quite a long time. It started in the primary system, and now it's working its way through to secondary school. And it's been known that it's been coming around about 2027, 28, 29. And Ms. Nola will explain, obviously, that when that occurs, then there is this mechanism to apply for basic need funding from the Secretary of State to be able to get an amount of money, if you haven't got it in Section 106 contributions in the system, for each pupil to help get, let's say, temporary provision at schools to help with the bulge, and that is a mechanism which I think you need to be aware of as well when you're assessing this problem looked at as a whole.
Is it Mr. Coyne next?
So, I think from the planning authority perspective, the position at the moment is, I would say, one of fairly significant frustration, if the truth be told. The assertion earlier that the number and the need has always been, I think, clear and ambiguous is certainly not the case. At Regulation 19, I think the position was that a school might be needed before 2031. We had agreed at submission. We had a political and officer duty to cooperate meeting immediately before submission, at which both leaders, officers, cabinet members were there. We agreed that the policy around both Heathlands and Invicta was agreeable to both parties. The plan was submitted, and then between submission and the hearings, that's where the position changed. Now, notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding the fact that I think we've seen that because the need is already in the system, that would suggest that this is need that should certainly have been identified in the work for the 2017 plan. But it's certainly not in the planning authority's interest to create a situation where there is a deficit of school places. And we've worked very hard with the DIO and Annington, and we're very grateful to both of them for the very positive manner in which they've worked with us to put together the position we've reached now, because the reality is that there are no other sites for a secondary school as we sit here in and around the town centre or the urban area that would be easily available. The site may not be available at the point when the county council wants it, but if this site is the only game in town as we sit here. Now, the reason we've asked in the main modification for the continual review of sites is because it could be that by the time we get to this point, that if the number has changed, that there might be another site available that might actually be more suitable, and we think it's entirely appropriate to make sure that we keep that as an option. We will still have this site identified within the plan. The main mod that we're seeking as well around reconfirming need, we've seen that the numbers have clearly gone wrong since 2017. So we think it's only right in terms of good use of land, and in terms of making sure that we provide the right site in the right place, that is reviewed at the time. Now, notwithstanding any of that, we have created a position here with Annington and the DIO where there is a site available. In terms of the point around the coincidence between the land boundary and the Annington ownership, that is a coincidence, and it does work. But equally, in terms of the numbers that we've got to achieve from the site, the 1,300, the only area on the site that will really allow us to do that is the Annington site. It's got easy access to the highway network at the south. We're putting higher density development to the west along the A229. And if we were to try and put a school site anywhere else, first of all, it would potentially prejudice the setting of Park House and the ancient woodland, and it would mean that access would need to go right through the site, which would compromise the redevelopment of the site. So this is entirely, in our view, the correct location on the overall Invicta Barracks site to identify a school site. In terms of the abnormal costs, you've heard from Mr. Hunter that it does sound like the figure of £55 million is very, very high. We're not aware. This is currently an area that's got some trees on it that are very old. They're not part of the green area that we're seeking to protect around the park house and the historic woodland. So it's got trees and it's got service personnel accommodation with gardens, which even at the time they were built would not have been built with gardens if it'd been used as a munitions dump or something. So we don't think the site is contaminated. The Invicta team agree with us on that. So what we're talking about here is the need for clearance and the need for some levelling on the site to create a development platform which is entirely doable. It's not a big square site as one would want ideally, but again, as Mr. Hunter said, you know, this is a high density development in an urban environment, effectively a new quarter for Maidstone town centre, and in that sorry, and I lost miserably, didn't I? But this this is this is a high density site in an urban setting. It's effectively a new quarter for the town centre. So we accept that the school will have to be different from what Kent County Council are used to building, but actually the surroundings make that an entirely appropriate thing to do. So since that time, we've worked with Kent County Council. We've had very recent political and officer meetings. We too, on a number of occasions, have thought things were agreed, only to subsequently establish that they actually weren't. That included at meetings with members. But we have committed in a draft of the statement of common ground that Kent have got, that we will seek to put together early developer contributions in order to facilitate the site clearance when it's transferred. So I think our position here, sir, we've also suggested in writing to the county council that if they're concerned about the mediation cost, there is a precedent here where Maidstone Borough and Kent County Council owned a site in the town centre, and they actually took out a joint insurance policy so that if the remediation costs exceeded a certain level, there was cover. There is a precedent, so we've suggested that to Kent County Council as a way forward. So I think so. In our view, we're certainly not sort of trying to avoid the need for a school. We found what we think is probably the only site in the foreseeable future. All we've sought to do is keep the flexibility in case that position changes, given we've seen the way the numbers can change. So we think where we've got to is entirely reasonable, sir.
Thank you. And before I go back to Kent County Council, did the Borough Council want to bring in, is it Ms. Nowler at this point?
Just going to bring Ms. Nola in.
Good morning, sir. Yes, really, I think the role I can play here this morning is perhaps twofold. One is to perhaps further explain how the additional basic need government funding can work in circumstances such as this, and also to have a little closer look at the forecasting and the trends of pupil numbers that have been coming through. So perhaps if I start with that latter one, I'm basing my assessments upon the ONS projections. These are population projections that were last cast in 2018. They usually do them biennially, so they should have done them in 2020, but because of the census, that didn't happen, and we are now waiting for new projections to be based upon the known census figures. So the 2018 projections take us through to 2043. And for the Maidstone Borough Council, which is as low as they go, we have a very clear trend that shows for the last 10 to 15 years there has been a growing number of children in the district, in the borough. This has been looming. It's common across the whole of England and Wales. I've checked quite a lot in the past few years, and this bulge, it varies between boroughs, but it is a common trend, and it's basically a result of the baby boomers. So essentially, my grandchildren perhaps are coming through into secondary school now. I'm the tail end of the baby boom bulge, and we've now got these children coming through across England. For most districts and boroughs, they are anticipated to start to reduce around now. For Maidstone, at the moment, the ONS is saying that's going to take a little longer. So KCC is correct in saying that there is still a number of children still to reach that peak. But the point I'm making is that it is a peak that is a demographic trend, not caused by local housing. The local housing that has been in has either benefited from existing school places or has contributed towards development contributions, S106. So the numbers that Kent forecast, I don't know now how they do their forecasting, but it's most education authorities base them upon birth rates, inward and outward migration trends, and then they distill them down to sub-areas. For secondary, they use two identifiers. One is selective schools across the borough, and the other is the non-selective schools across the borough. And for these purposes, we looked at the combination of the both. Certainly, as my colleague Mr. Hunter was saying, there have been variations in forecasting by the County Council, and the 2018 one was possibly an outlier, but it's certainly overstated by a good 1,000 to 2,000 pupils what they were expecting to see. That might have caused the result that we're seeing now, where the desire for the school came in earlier. The forecasts have been reduced since then, but still show the peak. Just to look at the most recent assessment for actual pupils in school in January 2022, I think. I don't think we have the 2023 ones yet. We have the potential for the admission of 2,315 pupils per year. That has been going up, and the offers that are published to have been made by Kent County Council into schools within Maidstone have now lied just below that for September 2022. So they came in at 2,296. That will vary because of pupils moving out of the borough before they take up those places, or some late entrants. So they are there or thereabouts, just under the published admission number. So numbers are tight, that is agreed. But they were foreseen. They've been coming through for the last 10, 12, 13 years. If I can turn to alternative funding streams, what we are really, I suppose, looking at is basic need. Now, when a county council or education authority submit their forecasts to the Department for Education, the DfE, they should not include any housing developments that have not been approved. So they should include anything that has been approved, so they know it's coming forward, so they know roughly when these houses are likely to happen and where. Alongside that, they are required to declare whether they have received or will receive any development contributions for any of those places. If they do, the government takes them out of their assessment as funded places, should new places be needed. If they are not funded by development contributions and there is a deficit forecast, then the government will meet that deficit through basic need funding. And when that is received, it is received en bloc by the authority. It is not predicated to a particular area or a particular type of school. It is simply a block of cash that the authority has to spend. So there is the potential for the county council to utilise some of that money in the interim before this new school is built. Is there anything else that I'm needed to elucidate on? Okay, Casey has just suggested that perhaps it might be useful if we take a brief look at how land can be identified if it doesn't come forward under the auspices of a local developer. And essentially that is through the offices, as Mr. Hunter already said, of the offices of Located, which is an arm of the DFE. They have the facilities to seek out land and purchase it for free schools and academies where necessary. So if the land on the Invicta Barracks had not been identified, then I'm sure Kent would have been looking, with the assistance of Located, to identify an alternative site. Well, clearly that's not been the case in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Obviously quite a bit there. So I would like to come back to Kent County Council because obviously you are seeking amendments to potential modifications to the policy. I think I'd be keen to understand from Kent County Council's perspective in terms of how it reconciles the need that may be arising now and in the short term compared with the availability of this site and the extent to which the plan has already pivoted to seek to accommodate particularly secondary education provision on this site already in terms of safeguarding that option for the county council should the need arise at the time that the site comes forward. Ms. Wigley.
So I will defer to Mr. Abrahams in a moment on some of the issues relating to, particularly to timing and when the need might arise, the basic need mechanism that's been mentioned, and the cost of construction and where that figure comes from. But if I could just deal with a couple of points before I do that. So it's been suggested that it's been in the public domain that Invicta might not be ready. So as I said, we are agnostic about where the site allocation is, but we did raise very early on in the Regulation 19 response concerns about delivery. We said we accepted the geographical location of Invicta to be acceptable in broad terms, but we raised a number of issues about its deliverability and that there may be a need for a different site if it's not deliverable. So we have always been consistent about that. So as for, we've moved, the plan's moved towards us. The requirements in national policy are clear that where there's a need for a school, the allocation should be set out in a development plan, and it should be clear. And this is in the PPG, at paragraph 008, that however that need arrives, there should be an allocation. Plans should seek to meet the development needs of their area, including community facilities such as schools. They should, at the appropriate level, allocate sufficient suitable land. Precise site allocation policies provide clarity and certainty by identifying the total amount required and any necessary characteristics for the school site, such as its shape, accessibility, service provision at an appropriate time. All those are very clear in policy. We have made clear throughout, from the early on, that there is this need. Now, I accept that the developer have challenged that or say they challenged that in the hearing that we weren't at. But Maidstone have never challenged that there is this need. We have been frustrated because, as I said, we had the policy wording which we thought was agreed back in November. So as for the basic need funding and the policy that relates to that, it's very clear in the document, which is cross-referenced in the PPG, that we should not be relying on basic need funding. And Mr. Abrams will explain why practically it's difficult to rely on that as well. But if you look at paragraphs 5 and 6 of that document, securing development contributions, it says central government basic need grant and other capital funding do not negate housing developers' responsibility to mitigate the impact of their development on education. It also talks about basic need allocations do not explicitly factor in funding for land acquisition. They also do not factor in abnormal costs. While basic need funding can be used for new school places that are required due to housing development, we would expect this to be the minimum amount necessary to maintain development. And so the costings, there's some difference between us, and Mr. Hunter, I think, said the work hasn't been done. Well, that's a problem, because the whole framework of planning policy in relation to plan making is that work needs to be done at the outset so that the viability and the costing can inform what's needed and what contributions might be needed in equalisation for the construction that's brought forward. So those are some headline points I wanted to respond to, but I'll now defer to Mr. Abrahams in relation to the timing predictions, the basic need, and how we've gone about the costings, and I might just jump back in at the end if that's all right.
Thank you. So I'm Nick Abrahams. I'm the Area Education Officer for Kent County Council in relation to West Kent, which includes Maidstone. So within the council, I'm the relevant head of service responsible for ensuring that the county council, as local education authority, discharges its statutory duty of ensuring that every child has a school place. That, of course, includes in the short, the medium, and the long term. So that's my my context. In relation to the local plan review, one of the things Ms. Wigley has highlighted, and I'd like to reiterate, is the County Council has been consistent throughout, and I think a couple of times it's been mentioned letters of this March. From our perspective, those letters have actually just reiterated consultation responses and other things from there. And if I go back to the County Council's strategy, proposed in responding to the local plan in terms of secondary provision. The overall response, of course, we respond to a chosen spatial strategy. We don't choose it. And for the local plan as a whole, with its spatial distribution of a new garden settlement at Heathlands and then other smaller, although some quite large, settlements in and around Maidstone town and to the north, our overall strategy, when assessed, has been for the appropriate establishment of a new secondary school at Heathlands to serve that development on its own as a new community, and then to look at how we would meet the need arising from all other allocations. And in essence, that strategy is to expand existing schools, but actually those existing schools are already at capacity. We're adding as much capacity as we can in those, but then to establish a new school. So our overall strategy in response to the Borough Council's proposals has always been the establishment of 2 new secondary schools within the plan. In terms of choosing where that second secondary school would go, i.e. the one that we're referring to at Invicta Barracks, the County Council has been agnostic about where it went. We did not select a geographic location or a particular site for that. The Borough Council chose Invicta Barracks to be the site allocated for that. Our response to that has consistently been, geographically, that's an appropriate area. We know a lot of the development outside of Heathlands will be in and around Maidstone town. It's served by transport and hopefully as much sustainable transport methods as possible. So subject to that kind of thing, we have no issue at all with the general geographic location. But we did highlight right from the beginning our concerns and worries about the deliverability of the specific site as it relates to timing, but also in terms of the site's existing use. And we can go back to the Regulation 19 consultation and likely before to show that. So that's the broad overview of our strategy in terms of need for secondary school provision going forwards. I think something that has come up today in particular has been around the certainty of our forecasts. What we can say is that no forecast on any subject will ever offer absolute certainty. But what we can see and observe through our own data is that since 2009, the County Council's forecast for secondary provision and need in Maidstone has on average been 99.4% accurate. That means on average since then we've under forecast by 0.6%. Some years it's been an over forecast, some under, but never further away than 3%. So in terms of that certainty, yes, in terms of that certainty, that's the average we're dealing with, 99.4% certainty. Applying 99.4% to our forecast would not diminish significantly the level of need we're looking at here. So in that sense, I think we can certainly address the level of certainty from that. In terms of how are these forecasts being derived, yes, it is of course a combination of extant consents from the previous local plan or the existing local plan. Of course, we do see new allocations coming in. In essence, what we're seeing and what we're forecasting is for housing completions in the future, the 19,000 or 19,500 or so throughout the whole local plan review period, to in essence keep and maybe slightly below the level of housing completions that the borough has averaged in recent years. So that's around, I think it's around 1,200 to 1,400 per year, isn't it? So we continue to see that grow. That's quite a significant number of new homes. There have, of course, been differences in the rate of completions, particularly in the pandemic years, in terms of particularly 2020 and 2021. We have seen a slight catch up in other things. One of the things I would say about Maidstone in particular is the general categorisation of bold secondary provision, so more year sevens needing a place now than in the past and will do in the future, can't really be applied to Maidstone. It can in general within Kent when you look at some of that data, but there are areas of Kent where that growth is going to be sustained. Now we can talk around the pace of how that's sustained, and actually our policy proposed wordings talk about responding to that pace. But there is no doubt that increased housing will have increased numbers of secondary school children needing a place. And in general, from the ED 100 trajectory, that's around 150 to 200 secondary pupils generated by new housing within the trajectory every year. In the short term, my role in terms of ensuring there are sufficient places is very challenging at the moment. This September coming, so September 23, we had the highest number of applicants for Year 7 provision than ever before. We are responding to that and our forecast by increasing provision, but we are getting to the stage where we cannot increase much further. I think one of the things to also note on forecasting, it's around supply and demand. So the numbers we've heard today are about total number of secondary pupils, not necessarily how that fits into the capacity of secondary schools. I think something that should be noted is that a school outside of the borough secondary school outside of the borough, but within certainly what we would generally, perhaps in the past, have said catchment of, for example, settlements like Staplehurst closed. So 2 years ago, a secondary academy was closed by the Department for Education. That's the loss of 900 secondary places. Now, not all of those would be attributed to secondary pupils in Maidstone, but it means we do lose that capacity in the area.
Sorry, Mr. Abrams, could I just interject here? I mean, it seems to me that there is currently an issue in terms of capacity. I think the council's described it as a kind of a bulge that's kind of coming through, and I think the reference was to whether that's a demographic, partly a demographic issue. I mean, I'm just trying to be sort of clear on Kent County Council's position, because on the Invicta site, as has been made clear to me, it's not currently available. It will not be made available. Early availability will be in 2027, but primarily the site in large comes available in 2029. Is Kent County Council's real concern about the overall strategy and trying to deal with an issue now versus what's potentially coming down the track with the Invicta Barracks site? I mean, should the plan be allocating or releasing another site now, or trying to identify another site now for a secondary school, having heard from the council that the Invicta Barracks site is the only sort of realistic option within the Maidstone urban area to deliver that? So the reality will be for Kent County Council in the interim period to try and accommodate the need as best it can within existing infrastructure, or as I've heard from the Borough Council, potentially DFE will step in and look at free school provision to meet need. I can't see how the Invicta site is going to help you in the short term, given its availability. Therefore, what's unsound about the policy approach for Invicta, safeguarding the county council the options subject to review, subject to, as Ms Thomas referred to, in terms of the council's proposed modification, in terms of needs and mechanisms for transfer to Kent County Council. I'm just trying to understand what further, or where the sort of the issue will be for the county council. Is it primarily you need another site and you need it now?
I think something the county council needs, and I would assume the growth in the local plan needs is certainty that the infrastructure, and we term secondary school provision as strategic infrastructure, given its large area that it serves, is going to be available. And to come back to the point around timing, 2027 is what we have highlighted as possibly the earliest date of requiring it. That is also why we raised the question about why the local plan would seek allocating a school that may be needed that early on a site that isn't available. I think for the county council, we find it hard to understand how we're able to give the requirements of what will be needed for the local plan, but we didn't choose the allocation for the difficulty. And absolutely, we're not seeking to diminish the work of the site promoters or owners, but the issue has been, if that site isn't available when we've said it may need to be available, where's the certainty within the plan that we're going to be able to accommodate all of the children arising from the plan? And on the second point, just on deliverability, again, our view is that all the contributing development should share the cost of that. We do not want Invicta. Apologies.
I'm reminded of this policy LPR SP13 in the plan on infrastructure delivery. It identifies various contributions under section 4 of that policy, one of which is education. You're shaking your head, Miss Wigley. You said you'd possibly come back in after Mr. Abraham, so whether that's...
So I'm not doubting your factual accuracy of what you just said by shaking my head. I do want to come back on that, but I also want Mr. Abrahams to be able to respond on the basic need issue and the cost of construction. So, but let me perhaps come back on that point first of all. The policy, the infrastructure policy, is in our view inadequate as a hook to enable the contributions that we will need for education. It's fairly low down that priority list, and there is no if it's this site, as I've said, it's going to be more expensive, and there's no way for the other allocated sites to be required to contribute to the delivery of the school on this site in terms of the actual amounts that we're going to require. And that policy, SPR 13, I think it is, effectively delegates to the allocation policies by saying that specific requirements will be set out in those allocation policies, and yet there is no detail on education in any of the housing allocation policies. There's no requirement for an education contribution. And so you'll be familiar with all the policy in the PPG about viability, that we down the road, if there's not specific, clear, set out requirements in the plan, it's very straightforward for developers to set out why things have changed since what they thought was in the plan, thought was going to be a requirement of the plan. Now the Education Authority are asking for a lot more, and they won't be able to provide it because they've paid too much for the land. So that's just on that LPR 13 point. Can I just ask Mr. Abrahams to just continue with what the other two topics he was going to talk about, which is the availability of basic need and the cost of construction.
Thank you. Well, here, just bear in mind, I had allocated about an hour and a half for the session. That appears to be a significant underestimation. I'm going to have to break for lunch because I've got a separate session this afternoon. So I'd advise we've probably got a maximum of about 10 minutes on this session. We'll see how far we get, but if people can bear that in mind in being sort of short and succinct on submissions, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll be as quick as I can on that. So just on the first point on basic need. Basic need is a government grant provided to local authorities, local education authorities. What that is an iterative grant. So we submit forecasts of need going forwards against capacity, and where the two are different, i.e. there's a greater need than capacity, the grant formula provides an element of capital funding to, in essence, try to fill that gap. Now, the amount of funding will not fund, it's general per place, so it doesn't relate to the specific cost of a scheme. So, for example, the cost per pupil of a new secondary school is greater than the cost of expanding an existing school. The basic need grant is blind to that. So again, it also is iterative. It only provides us places needed 2 years in advance, and so it comes in as a cash flow wise, bit by bit. The full quantum doesn't add up to the full need. Plus the point Ms. Wigley made earlier, in that guidance is quite explicit that we shouldn't be using basic need unless there are opportunities to secure developer contributions. I think on the point I'd like to address earlier is around why the County Council hasn't declared any funding from developer contributions for new pupils arising in Maidstone in recent years. That is because since October 2017, the Borough Council adopted SIL, and we have, on every planning application, put in a letter that outlines the need and how much we would seek from that, and we've had no Section 106s signed since 2017 in Maidstone, nor any SIL provided to us by Maidstone. There has been one opportunity to bid for that SIL. That was last May. We are still awaiting the outcome of whether our bid for new secondary school places has been successful. So that really is the case on that. And really, just finally, the reason we haven't started to commence other routes to providing land, for example, using the DFE's processes of land acquisition, is because we've been trying to work within, as we do across Kent, with borough councils to integrate our secondary school provision within local plans, and therefore we felt we had a local plan allocation that was coming through to provide for that, and therefore not the need to go outside of town planning to do that. And just really finally on the cost of construction, we're absolutely fine with, and we're agnostic to what the cost is, as long as we all know what that cost is and it can be shared appropriately. But at the moment, with a site that has got residential dwellings on it, mature trees, we know it will cost more than if it didn't have. Therefore, we feel that cost needs to be known by everybody, including the Borough Council for its viability assessment, and therefore within policy, so we can secure developer contributions towards that cost. We do not want the owner of the site or promoter to be disadvantaged from that perspective. It should be proportionate and fair across all development.
Thank you. Can I bring in DIO next, and then I'll let the council conclude on this session. So, Mr. Keane.
Thank you, sir. Just very quickly, I take issue with the fact that the local plan allocation is a hook for what planning obligations are secured, because regardless of what is in the local plan, planning obligations are secured via either Section 106 or SIL and allocated on the basis of need at the time the development comes forward, because ultimately any contribution has to be SIL Reg 122 compliant and fulfill the tests of SIL Reg 122. So regardless of what's in the local plan, even if a secondary school site is allocated, if the need is not established at the time a development comes forward, then SIL Reg 122 is the overriding principle that is applied, and the evidence is accordingly. And just a very quick point also, the amount of planning obligations any development does allocate has to be commensurate to their child yield, and certainly from an Invicta point of view, you're only looking at approximately a net number of probably in the region of one form entry's worth of secondary school pupils, which is the maximum that they would, under the test of SIL Reg 122, physically be able to legally provide, as anything else would be over provision. And the same applies to any other development coming forward in Maidstone.
Thank you. Mr. Tennant.
Thank you, sir. I'll be very brief. So, just to summarise, before Mr. Keane concludes, Invicta is an active military establishment. It's been advertised by the Secretary of State for disposal, and that advertised date is circa 2029, although there is an option for an early release phase of some housing, approximately 125 dwellings within the first 2 years. But Invicta is an urban brownfield site. It's very different to Heathland, it's very different to Lidsing, and the assimilation of that site is different, and it is a site that the master plan, as you've seen from our vision document, is a constraints-led master plan, and we very carefully look to see how the DIO can bring forward 1,300 homes, but working in partnership with Addington, can look at a comprehensive redevelopment of the site. The DIO have not shied away from the provision of social infrastructure and other infrastructure across the site. The main mods that we've been proposed to the hearings have added additional elements of infrastructure provision that has been agreed by all parties. We have heard today arguments for and against the need case, and again, the main modifications give sufficient flexibility to assess the need case at the time the site comes forward. The need for a new secondary school in Maidstone is not an issue that Invicta has to solve. It's a Maidstone-wide issue. It's a Kent County Council issue, and unfortunately, it's their failure to bring forward secondary school provision on the basis that existing children who are already in the system will need to have the education provided circa 2027. It's that failure, unfortunately, that is leading us to where we are now. It's also slightly exacerbated, and I'll finish here,
by the reduction in capacity within Kent with the closure of High Weald Academy, which is just down the road on the A229 in Cranbrook in September last year. And that hasn't helped with the provision of secondary school places in Kent. So just to conclude, sir, DIO have worked positively and proactively in partnership with Maidstone Borough Council, and we've been on the same meetings with KCC, and we continue to work positively and proactively, but the main modifications give sufficient flexibility to future use of the site coming forward.
So, three things very quickly. So first, you've been referred a couple of times to the securing contributions document, the DFE document 2019, and in particular paragraph 5. So this development, the Invicta Barracks development, would make an appropriate provision for education, and it would do so consistent with the PPG. You've been referred to various paragraphs. I'd also remind you, sir, of 10.029, which talks about the need for funding for construction of land for new schools required on site commensurate with the level of educational need generated by the development. Second point, sir, 55 million we hear today. It may be I've missed it, sir, but as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen, no one on this side of the room has seen any evidence to support any such figure by way of any assessment that's before you. And you've heard from Mr. Hunter and from the council, the Borough Council, on their view on costings. And thirdly, sir, the county's representations in relation to the effects of the bulge in need prior to a time when a school can come forward on this site, 2033, and as to which we still have no meaningful answer from Kent. So that should not be allowed to derail or question or put into doubt the soundness of what is clearly a suitable, as you've found in your interim findings, sir, and indeed arguably the most sustainable local plan housing site. Thank you.
And to bring this education matter to conclusion, is it Mr. Coyne and then Mr. Edgerton?
Just very quickly, sir. I would just reiterate a little bit of my sort of sentiments from earlier, in that we have worked very, very hard to get to where we are. We think it's an entirely reasonable position. We think we've got the certainty there to provide the school as soon as a site in the town central or urban area can be provided. If Kent had been worried about this previously, they could, as we've heard, have gone to the Education Commissioner at that point. This shift in timing, I would just remind you, sir, is not unique to this site either. You'll recall the main mod that we brought forward for Heathlands in the stage 1 hearings, because at submission we were being told that the secondary school on the Heathlands site would not be required until post 2037. But then between submission and the hearings, that came forward, it was needed by 700 occupations at about 2032. We've worked with the Heathlands team to accommodate that.
Mr. Edgerton, please.
Very briefly, sir. Fundamental concept. The local plan review does not create growth. It does not create growth. It actually, in fact, in this occasion, potentially holds growth to a lower level than would otherwise exist through the standard methodology at 1157 units per annum, rather than well above 1,200 units per annum. So the fallback position here, sir, is something which is absolutely vital to consider, and that is that the local plan review at the moment is seeking to accommodate the growth, including providing for education in the best way that it can, including on allocated sites where they are indeed necessary and due to be received by the Education Authority, but also through SP13 in terms of planning obligations. The fallback for that, sir, would be growth at the developer's whim, but it would still be the same level of growth, if not higher. The final thing, sir, is just to refer you to the planning obligations, PPG, particularly paragraph 007, which makes it absolutely clear the hierarchy that exists in terms of the government providing funding to local authorities for the provision of new school places based on forecast shortfalls in school capacity, and there's also a central programme for the delivery of new free schools with planning obligations filling any gaps, and I'll just refer you to that as well, sir. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Thomas.
And one sentence, it seems clear from what we've heard that, the county council should be getting this site in the bag, and that the bulge that is coming can be dealt with through either the infrastructure policy, getting relevant Section 106 contributions, and the basic need mechanism. And I think that's really encapsulates where we are.
Thank you. Can I thank everybody for their contributions on the education discussion? I see Mr. Wright is back in the room. I'm mindful this is really the only sort of scheduled slot for Invicta related discussion, and I don't know if there's time for a full formal adjournment, but I don't know if we are able to briefly discuss the highways matter now.
The risk of intruding on everyone's sandwich, so I was going to say that, as you know, Mr. Jones is here, and I'd certainly, if it would be helpful to you, sir, I would be very happy for him to spend a couple of minutes, very briefly, just telling you where he thinks we're at with the highways position for the barracks.
Would you be prepared, Miss Wigley, to bring Mr. Wright to the table? Is Mr. Wright in a position to join us?
A couple of minutes, just because I just haven't had an opportunity to speak to Mr. Wright at all about this.
Excuse me. Yes, we literally take a 2-minute adjournment. So if anybody is not participating in this discussion and by all means wants to take a lunch break or a break now, by all means you're free to go. But if we can be back in this room literally in a couple of minutes, and I'll see where we are. But I would like to be able to conclude Invicta today. Thank you. Okay, we'll now resume the hearing. Are we in a position, Ms. Wigley, to
So we're in a position to tell you where we are. One wrinkle is that because obviously this wasn't programmed, I understand that National Highways also wanted to comment and attend, and obviously they didn't expect it to be today either. So that's another procedural issue. But we are, Mr. Sorry, I've forgotten. Right, Mr. Wright, will explain. We'll be able to explain where we've got to in terms of main modifications.
Okay, thank you. But before you start, Mr. Wright, I mean, obviously this is in. You will recall we obviously had the discussion back on the 24th of November regarding this particular site. The policy itself identifies in phase 2 of the development A29 junction improvements being completed. My recollection is that further work would help inform the soundness of the submitted approach, and that's contended to be provided in the technical note from WSP, which is ED examination document 96, to which Kent County Council helpfully responded to my related question in terms of the findings of that report. And I think what I'm interested in, Mr. Wright, is whether it's kind of shifts the dial for Kent County Council, or it reaffirms what's already in the policy in terms of what might be required for this site.
Thank you, sir. Yes, it does. What that evidence is telling us is that there are corridors, in particular the A229, that are already operating at capacity. So there is a likelihood that mitigation will be required at an earlier stage than is currently specified in the policy. So we're very much of the view that off-site interventions to improve the highway network are going to be needed up front as part of phase 1, as opposed to phase 2 as currently drafted in the policy. And I think just to add to that, we also would want reassurance around funding mechanisms, and clearly it's important that the infrastructure delivery plan is updated in light of this evidence and provides clarity and certainty around how these particular mitigation interventions will be delivered.
Thank you. For DIO, will it be Mr. Jones in terms of the work that's been done?
Thank you, sir. I think quick one for myself really in response to supplementary question. We've worked sort of tirelessly with Maidstone Borough Council and Kent County Council since the last hearing, provided the extra modelling, looked at the, in fact it's a Maidstone Borough Council original design solution that proposed signalisation of the A229 roundabout, and we believe that still works, the evidence still proves that works, and then we've done a road safety audit to back that up. So to answer the question of SQ13, we think we've provided everything to the satisfaction of both Maidstone Borough Council and Kent County Council. With regard to the funding element, I'll pass over to one of my colleagues.
Thank you, sir. Just to clarify that, we're slightly surprised that National Highways want to be involved in a future Invicta highway session when there's no highways issues identified within the programme, and the technical work has been completed by DIO's representatives at WSP and is in broad agreement with all the technical parties. So we're a little bit surprised by that. The second point, I will pick up on the financial arrangements. You will recall in the existing policy wording for the Invicta site that there will be a bespoke infrastructure funding agreement put in place to look at the direct financial and mitigation requirements that arise from the development, and the DIO are happy to enter into that bespoke infrastructure funding agreement to address any infrastructure requirements, whether that be on or off-site.
In terms, obviously, the policy sets out the phasing for infrastructure, or the trigger points for infrastructure, indicative infrastructure to be secured. What would be the DIO's position on Mr. Wright's suggestion that A229 junction improvements move into phase 1?
The position that we consider is that the A229 is broken as it is. It's not the Invicta Barracks scheme that breaks the A229 corridor. So whether it comes forward in phase 1 or phase 2, I don't think it's necessarily an issue that we need to discuss. It would be perhaps better from a construction point of view if the technical work to the A229 roundabout is completed in phase 1. So we've got no objection to that, but yeah, it's not Invicta that's broken the A229. So whether it's phase 1, phase 2, I don't think we've got an issue with that, sir.
Thank you. Is there any Mr. Lewis for the Borough Council, please?
Thank you, sir. Just to clarify the Borough Council's work that's been ongoing and their position at the current time, they have been in close liaison with Kent County Council and National Highways in respect of work that is currently ongoing, modelling work and scheme mitigation work for the A229. That's both for M20 Junction 6 and junctions towards the town centre. That work is ongoing at the moment, but I'll concentrate on Junction 6 first of all. The position of National Highways, as we left it in the most recent meetings, is that they would like to see a form of mitigation for the entire scheme tested and modelled as the backstop if it's required. And then that scheme and its implementation date time in terms of the build out of the development will be determined again by the monitor and manage strategy that Maidstone is proposing to place within the main modifications to be discussed. That way there's a backstop, an ultimate backstop. If a scheme is required, then it's a case for monitor and manage and an agreement within a planning permission to decide when the appropriate time is. So on one side we have Kent saying they want it early, on the other side we have the promoter saying possibly later, but monitor and manage will give the highway authorities and the borough council the relevant planning controls to enable them to say when it's required.
I think we'll pick up the monitor and manage approach as part of the transport policy session. Okay, I've got nothing further I wanted to raise on highways. Before I close the session, is there anything further anybody wishes to?
So I think Mr. Wright just wants to respond very briefly on that monitor and manage point.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I need to say really that the evidence is very strongly pointing us in the direction that these mitigation interventions are needed up front. So monitor and manage, whilst that's a means of checking further down the line what may be required when, we have to be led by the evidence that's in front of us now, which is telling us early delivery of highway mitigations will be required.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, if it's a very brief point, please.
Apologies, sir. Just the key bit from the modelling for Invicta Pile Barracks specifically was the data that we received is that with or without our development. So the key bit is we're not responsible for any of the junctions that are already at capacity. That's a wider local plan.
Understood. Okay, can I thank everybody for their contributions on the Invicta Barracks site discussion, part 2. Certainly things for me to reflect on. In terms of the examination today, we've obviously run over a little bit. The room will need to be prepared for the afternoon session. So I'm going to suggest reconvening back here at 2:15, so slightly behind where we'd need to be, but hopefully we'll get back on track this afternoon. Okay, thank you everybody, and I'll see some of you again this afternoon shortly. Thank you.
Thank you for sitting late, sir, to accommodate us while we're all here.